you know, the original saga was about the father, the children, and the grandchildren. And, I mean, that's not a secret to anybody. It's even in the novels.
The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
The Star Wars novels provide that chance to follow the adventures through more than 100 novels. It's an investment that can keep you reading for years and years and years.
Darth Plagueis is an official Star Wars novel written by author James Luceno. Released on January 10th, 2012, the book is among the last additions to the saga told as part of the original continuity before the Disney acquisition and regulation of EU to Legends in 2014. Originally pitched as a story strictly about Darth Plagueis, it was decided after Luceno had outlined his first version of the story that it should have more focus on Palpatine. Luceno had been thinking about Palpatine a lot as far back as Cloak of Deception, Labyrinth of Evil, and Dark Lord. So by the time he started writing, he felt like he knew Darth Sidious better than any other character he'd written for. It was originally slated for October 2008, but its release was cancelled for a period of time. Sue Rostoni wrote, "We decided that this was not the right time to delve into Palpatine's backstory and Plagueis' beginnings." The novel was apparently replaced with the Darth Bane Rule of Two book, which is heavily referenced in the Plagueis novel. Speaking of continuity, Luceno has said that when he first became involved with the franchise, that he made it a goal to catch up on everything that had been written to that point. It's the history of the Star Wars galaxy and he enjoys emphasising continuity. He thinks by doing that, those references make the world more realistic. If you're particularly interested in Sith lore, I'd recommend the Star Wars Marvel Purist channel. He does loads of great research and he really knows his stuff. In fact, he actually did a few streams with Raging Rhino about the Darth Plagueis novel, so I highly recommend that and make sure you sub to both of those channels. Another great lore channel while I'm at it is OG Star Wars. She does her CAF chats on Thursdays and she's currently covering the Book of Sith, so make sure you go and support and subscribe to her as well. So as I was saying, Lucasfilm were prepared to let the project slide, but Luceno had done so much development into the background of the characters, he wasn't prepared to let it go. So he worked closely with Howard Roffman, who was the vice president of Lucasfilm licensing at the time, to finally get the project accepted for publication. He submitted many versions of the outline before there was a consensus of where they were going to take the story. Please listen to Luceno's own recollection.
Going back to Plagueis, when I first submitted an outline, it was just sent back to me saying, like, you're on the wrong page here. Right. So I had to fight hard to rework that one and get it to the place where it was finally accepted. Yeah. I was fortunate enough to have it canceled once, and then I got to spend 5 years with it.
What a beautiful book. With Darth Plagueis, you got to have a lot of conversations about exactly how you were going to tie.
At the upper level, that was very rewarding.
Conversations at the upper level included George Lucas himself. Luceno has stated that Lucas was involved in the early stages. When the book was proposed, he asked George if Plagueis could be a non-human. Lucas wrote him back saying that Plagueis could be a moon, and even sent some artistic renderings of the character. It was also his idea that Plagueis should have an accident that causes him to wear a mask. But hey, George Lucas didn't care about the EU and he had zero involvement. So Luceno was working closely with Lucas's right-hand man, Howard Roffman. He even had to bypass both Del Rey and the usual editorial staff at Lucasfilm to work directly with Roffman. From that point on, everything was approved, and it was said to be at the highest level. The marketing text that it was canon at the highest level was actually true, because everything was approved at the highest levels at Lucasfilm. Luceno didn't speak directly with Lucas, but a lot of that approval came from George through Howard Roffman. The official Star Wars website offered up this description of the novel, saying, "Star Wars fans have been clamouring to know more about Plagueis. Author James Luceno delves into the secrets of the dark side to find out more about Darth Sidious and Darth Plagueis in a new hardcover novel." Please listen to Howard Roffman as he explains the importance of the expanded universe and how it saved Star Wars from obscurity.
So I went out there to every retailer and every licensee trying to convince them to restock Star Wars. And to one, they told me, "Kid, Star Wars is dead." So I had to go back to George Lucas and deliver the news. So I'll never forget it. I walked into his office and I said, George, I hate to tell you this, but Star Wars is dead. And he looked at me and narrowed his eyes. And he said, no, it's not dead. It's just taking a rest. I waited a few years to let those original kids grow up, to be young adults going to college, starting their own careers. And that was the point that we started asking ourselves a key question. How would this group like to interact with Star Wars today? And the answer was pretty obvious. Star Wars is a mythology. It's story-driven. Our hunch was that what people really craved was to carry the story forward. And the easiest way to test the waters was through books, because it's a lot cheaper to write a book than it is to make a movie. So we hired a great science fiction author, and he wrote a novel set after Return of the Jedi called Heir to the Empire. And to everyone's surprise, it went to #1 on the New York Times bestseller list and stayed on the list for 19 weeks. So we continued. More novels. There was a series of new comics, all bestsellers. We had our own video game company, LucasArts, and we started doing Star Wars computer games. And we knew that to have all these different writers writing new stories in different media, we had to lay down some ground rules. And the most important rule was something called continuity. All these stories had to be consistent with the movies, but also consistent with each other. Otherwise, the integrity of the mythology would be stripped away.
If you were paying close attention, Roffman put a lot of emphasis on the importance of continuity. These stories had to not only be consistent with the movies, but with each other to maintain the integrity of the mythology. Next, listen as Roffman explains how before Disney, Lucas was in charge and everyone worked around him. And after George exited the company, the movies were made more by a committee who didn't consist of people who understood the Star Wars saga or its mythology.
It was pre-Disney. We had the luxury of being a completely private company. We had one shareholder named George Lucas, and that was it. So we served him. We weren't driven by quarterly results or any of the things that drive public companies. And it was very clear in the scheme of things that George was the person who was making the films. So he worked according to his own schedule, and we had to work around that. The creative center of the company completely changed. Before, it was George Lucas. George exited the company. All of a sudden, you had Kathy Kennedy, who was, a very talented filmmaker and producer, but she's not George Lucas, and she understood that she was playing a different role. So she had to kind of assemble a creative bench in a way that we never had before. So you have a lot of people weighing in, not always people who have the same deep understanding of what the Star Wars saga is about, particularly mythologically and some of the reasons that it appeals so deeply to people. So it was a little bit more of filmmaking by committee.
Please listen to this next clip and I'll explain a few things afterwards.
No, we controlled it very tightly. And that was one of my mandates, because when I began the spin-off publishing program, it was a sacrosanct rule that everything had to relate to each other, be consistent with each other, and of course be consistent with the movies, which were canon. And that was different from the way that Star Trek had done things. And we were pretty religious about doing that. Our biggest problem was a guy named George Lucas, because he didn't necessarily buy into the spin-off fiction and game program and all the alternate universe that we were creating. We wanted it to be one universe. We really felt strongly that that was what it needed to be. But George, as the filmmaker, didn't want to be beholden to somebody else's creative vision. So we would have very interesting skirmishes, because we had a bunch of stuff that became, for the fans, pretty much canon about what happened after Return of the Jedi, what different places in the galaxy were called, and lots of different things. And if he was proposing to do something in the prequels that contradicted that, we would have long debates that usually ended, at least in the first session, with, I don't care, this is what I'm doing. And maybe in the fourth or fifth session would be, well, all right, we could change it this way. That was kind of how it operated.
So in this clip, Roffman said spin-off, He's talking there about the publishing as a different medium from the movies. Everything had to relate to each other and to George's movies. He also said that George didn't necessarily buy into the spin-off fiction because, as we know and have explained before, George didn't want to be bound by anything. He wanted creative freedom as a creator should, which we understand is how the EU worked. It was all bound by his movies. Finally, he said he would have conversations with George concerning the prequels and things that could potentially contradict the expanded universe. George obviously pushed back, but eventually agreed to make some changes. Now that doesn't sound like someone that didn't care about the fans or the lore. I've seen people take this clip out of context and claim as such. In fact, it mirrors the cherry-picked quote from George about the 3 pillars. George has actually stated himself that Howard and licensing fill in the gaps between the movies. In this next clip, Howard Roffman explains this in his own words.
George has been quoted, he said the 3 pillars of Star Wars are himself, you, meaning marketing, and the fans. Does your role with Lucasfilm licensing really require you to create Star Wars canon and fill in the blanks for George? How does that all work?
Well, we decided a long time ago, and actually this was kind of goes back to the beginning of when I became the head of licensing, that it was silly to let Star Wars just live within the boundary then of the 3 movies, but now of the 6 movies. That it was such a vast, well-defined universe that George had created with all these interesting characters and places and situations that we really needed to go beyond that, because that's what fans wanted. They wanted it in the form of books and comics. They wanted it in the form of video games. There's so many different ways that you can tell additional stories in the Star Wars universe. We wanted all the things that we did in this expanded universe to be consistent with what's the canon that's in the films, but we also wanted it to be consistent within itself, so that it had an integrity as a part of the Star Wars galaxy. And it took on a life of its own. It was wildly embraced by the fans. It was more successful than we honestly ever expected. And as you can imagine, over the 20-some years that we've been doing it, it's grown, and we've created an enormous galaxy. What that meant was that George is well in control of the movies and the TV shows, and that's his world. So he calls himself the father, and the world outside of that is way too big for him to personally supervise, and he's entrusted that to me, and he calls me the son in that holy trilogy.
How you're able to keep track of that, I'll never know.
Well, the truth is, I keep track of it because I have an amazing staff, and the people who work for me are just brilliant at what they do, and they're very dedicated and passionate about this, and they're the ones who know all the detail.
So, it's all part of the saga. There's just too much for George to keep track of, as he's more focused on his world, the movies. That's why he hired other people to do it for him. It's just like when Leland Chee elaborated on the infamous Starlog quote, where people like to say it's a parallel universe. It's been disproven time and time again. Lastly, on canon and continuity, I want to share Luceno's thoughts on the discarding of the EU.
We've asked this question to some of the other authors that we've talked to a while back when the Legends thing sort of happened.
Yeah.
How do you feel about the title Legends and kind of what happened with all of the novels?
For me, I can almost dismiss that Legends banner. I just have my own sense of the saga, the way it's played out, sort of almost like an alternative history. So all those stories are still in my head, and I think it's going to take more than a banner on a book to make me change my mind about what Tim Zahn did, or what Mike Stackpole did, or what any of us have done.
He's also said what we already know, that the idea of a story group is really nothing new, because continuity was already being maintained pre-Disney.
From my earliest involvement with the franchise, going all the way back to 2000, there has always been sort of a form of the story group. I mean, we always used to meet editors and writers, and we'd trade ideas, and it really hasn't changed much. I mean, the personnel have changed, and there are more voices involved than there were, 15 years ago.
Sure.
But the process remains the same. Plagueis is out there for anybody that wants to read it, and they can take the book as legends or as canon, depending on their own, whatever their own viewpoint is.
He was wary that they would alienate long-time fans, and he even hints that TCW already broke canon. The last thing I want to discuss is Palpatine's Disney-designated name. The name SHEEV was revealed in Luceno's book Tarkin, which is considered by Disney as a canon novel.
And you got an exclusive in the Tarkin novel. I read it. I love it. You got to name.
No,
you didn't.
I got to reveal the name.
You got to reveal.
Yes, that was George's name.
For those that don't know, what name?
SHEEV.
And who's
Palpatine.
that?
Yeah, there we
SHEEV Palpatine.
SHEEV Palpatine. George had that under his hat for a long time, and finally decided he was willing to let go.
Why reveal it now? Why specifically now?
I think because he was done with the franchise.
Right. So here's all my info.
I'm putting words in his mouth. I don't know why he decided to do it then.
Right.
Yeah, Tarkin book, very, very short timeline. Unfortunately, only about 6 months from conception to submission.
Luceno said that George had had that name for a really long time, and that he'd finally decided to let it go. Remember, George sold the company in 2012, so he was no longer involved at this point. We're told that the Tarkin novel was written in a 6-month period from conception. That book was released in November 2014, so it can only have went into production as early as the beginning of that year. So I don't think that George told them that this was the right time to reveal that name, because he wasn't there. For at least the past 2 years, he hadn't been there.
Right. Well, what happened was, I was somewhere in the, first draft, or maybe I was already at revisions at that point, and I heard from the story group that, that asked me, are you interested in, revealing the name that George created? I think it was for Underworld, the TV series, the live-action TV series that was in the works a couple of years back. I sort of got the sense, though, that George had the name for quite a while, and that people at Lucasfilm had been sitting on the name for a long time. So I actually wrestled with putting his name in the book, because I realized, in Darth Plagueis, I was, sort of skirting that whole issue, and how was this going to fit in? But I knew that it was going to get used by someone.
In fact, it was the story group who asked if Luceno wanted to reveal the name that George apparently created. He got the sense that George had had this name for a while, and that Lucasfilm had been sitting on it. In the Darth Plagueis novel, Palpatine's name isn't revealed. In fact, in the novel it specifically said that Palpatine goes by that name alone. And as we discussed, George had involvement in the Plagueis novel through Howard Roffman, so wouldn't that have been an ideal time to reveal the name? Lucas was also involved in another one of Luceno's EU novels. While writing Cloak of Deception, Luceno was given access to scripts from Attack of the Clones, and was specifically instructed by George Lucas to write a political thriller that focused on the Galactic Republic Senator Palpatine and Chancellor Valorum. He forbade Luceno from revealing that Palpatine and Sidious were the same person, as he considered it to be a spoiler. So wouldn't this have been another opportune time to reveal Palpatine's name as SHEEV? I just really find it hard to believe that this is something that George had all this time. If he didn't use it, there was probably a reason for it. Unless an idea is included in a final product, that's all it is, it's an idea. Just like Lucas's many different sequel trilogy ideas, they were never set in stone. So SHEEV's a Disney Star Wars edition, and I see a lot of people trying to use George's name to legitimize it. If George really wanted that name to be in one of the books, then it would have been there. So please feel free to stick around for my highlights from Darth Plagueis. We start out with the death of Plagueis. Sidious was uncertain if he had killed him or if he had already achieved immortality. No, the being who had guided him to power was gone. Though he could save others from death, he had failed to save himself. They were two beings in a galaxy of countless trillions, but what had transpired would affect the lives of them all. It had already been changed by the birth of one, and now reshaped by the death of another. Had his enemies felt the irrevocable shift in the Force? Well, now the work of vengeance could begin. The dark side had made him its property, and he made it his. We learn about Plagueis' master, Darth Tenebris. He's a Bith and he wears a breathing device, and he's actually found something special about the planet Baldemnik. Darth Bane would appreciate our efforts, the Sith Master said. Plagueis had actually been the apprentice of Darth Tenebris for longer than the average human might live. Darth Bane had refined the Sith by limiting their number and operating from concealment. He had mined Cortosis as a youth long before embracing the dark side. In the 1,000 years since his death, he had become deified. Cortosis ore, or the fabled ore, has the ability to diminish the effectiveness of a lightsaber. The Jedi Order had restricted the mining and refinement of the ore. As they try to escape from an explosion, Plagueis uses the Force to drop falling rocks on top of Tenebris. Tenebris said to be strong in the Force is one thing, but to believe oneself to be all-powerful is to invite catastrophe. You are fated to bring the Sith imperative to fruition. It falls on you to bring the Jedi Order to its knees and save the galaxy's sentient beings from themselves. Plagueis says, "You are the last of the vaunted rule of two. The new order begins now and will be for 1,000 years under my control." Plagueis believed that midichlorians stood in the way of a being's ability to contact the Force. He had honed an ability to perceive the actions of midichlorians, but not yet the ability to manipulate them. The midichlorians were not Force-carrying particles, they functioned as translators of the will of the Force. Azamun, Plagueis views his allegiance to the Force as an investment that could be maximized to yield great returns. The last Sith to essence transfer had died with the knowledge of that process. Plagueis calls on the Force to numb himself from pain. He gives up trying to ward off blood-sucking insects. Let them devour the old Plagueis, he thought. After a millennium of purposeful sleep, the power of the dark side would be reborn, and he would carry the long-forged plan to completion. Tenebris had never slept, but then few Bith did. Plagueis was now the only Sith Lord descended from the Bane line, a true Sith, not a pretender. Bane had rid the Sith Order from infighting and instated the rule of two. A master to embody power, and an apprentice to crave it. We learn about the ship crew of the Woebegone. Hyperspace beacons were few and far between. A lapse of judgment could result in disaster. Plagueis had stowed away on the ship. We learn that moons have 3 hearts. 2 are under voluntary control, so they can alter their temperature and blood flow. Calling on the Force to mend ruptured arteries, torn muscles, or broken bones was no more difficult than levitating slabs of stone. But such refurbishments had little effect on a being's outer shell, which was essentially the domain of the midichlorians, despite their physical presence in living cells. One of the crew members had slightly higher than normal midichlorian count, but not high enough to make him Force sensitive. Plagueis could not only sense the strength of the Force in others, but also perceived the midichlorians that individualized forceful beings. We learn Plagueis' real name, which is Magister Higo Damask. If you're not sure about the novel, I recommend reading that chapter to get a taste of what it's like. The alter ego of Darth Tenebris was Rugis Gnome. Moons were said to abhor literature, but Plagueis had one of the finest libraries. He owned biological studies of the Islamiri and Vornskers from Merkur. Plagueis says, "The goal is to extend my life indefinitely and conquer death." Despite the recent amplification of his powers, he sensed that his midichlorian count had not increased. Research had established that blood transfusions from Force-sensitive individuals did not confer Force powers to recipients, though blood with a high midichlorian count could grant temporary strength and resiliency. There's mention of Exar Kun, Darth Bane, and Darth Zana. Darth Bane had learned the technique of essence transfer from a holocron of Darth Andedu. Crucial Sith knowledge had been lost with Darth Gravid. Plagueis talks with Gardula the Hutt. I've heard that the people who reside on Tatooine age prematurely. The ancient Sith at one point had an outpost on Tatooine. Gardula the Hutt wants a pod racing track like the one on Malastare with an annual race and for Plagueis to be her silent partner. Plagueis attempts to use a mind trick, but it doesn't work on the Yinchori species. Plagueis meets Darth Tenebris's other apprentice, Darth Venomous. To Plagueis, lightsaber duels were a tedious affair full of wasted emotion. The future of the Sith no longer hinges on physical prowess, but on political cunning. The new Sith will rule less by brute force than by means of instilling fear. Plagueis was raised to believe in the elimination of competitors and viewed the Jedi as just that. They had to be undermined, toppled and dismantled. Like Plagueis, Tenebris had obviously embraced the fact that Darth Bane's rule of two had expired. Precious few Sith Lords had honoured it, and with good reason, as Plagueis saw it. For the past 500 years, the Sith of the Bane line hadn't strictly selected children for apprentices, finding it more advantageous to discover beings who had already been hardened or scarred by life. As a youngling, Plagueis discovered he had the ability to manipulate people. Other children became playthings instead of playmates. On many occasions, his father met with Jedi Knights and Padawans who came to Maigito in search of the Dagus crystals, which the Jedi Order used in the construction of training lightsabers. Tenebris had conscripted Plagueis' mother as a disciple to give birth to a child strong in the Force, so he could have an apprentice. Tenebris says, "We Sith are an unseen opposition, a Phantom Menace. Where the Sith once wore armor, we wear cloaks, but the Force works through us all, the more powerful in our invisibility. For the present, the more covert we remain, the more influence we can have. Our revenge will be achieved not through subjugation, but by contagion." The Jedi had emerged strong from the war of a millennium earlier. It was decided that the Sith would hide in plain sight, amassing wealth and knowledge and securing contacts and alliances. The Sith had the luxury of studying the Order from afar without the Jedi even knowing that they had adversaries. Plagueis tracks down a few of the potential Sith apprentices from Darth Venomous's list. He lets one go, kills another for promoting the techniques of Darth Bane, and the third is killed by two Jedi. Plagueis even has a conversation with the two Jedi and they don't realise that he's a dark side Force user. Plagueis believed that the Sith line would continue through him or not at all. 60 years earlier there had been a war between the Naboo and the Gungans. Plagueis learns that word of one of his business deals had been leaked by none other than the son of a noble family. He goes simply by the name Palpatine. For many years, Plagueis detested the company of humans. When Plagueis meets Palpatine, he takes him on a tour of Theed. Palpatine's father was a wealthy, influential royal who wanted Naboo to remain independent and isolated. Palpatine, on the other hand, wants Naboo to break away and belong to the greater galaxy. Palpatine owns a landspeeder that he races competitively. He also agrees to spy on his father's dealings on behalf of Damask Holdings, but only if he can report exclusively to Plagueis. When he was younger, Palpatine was responsible for the deaths of two pedestrians while on his speeder. He bounced from one private school to the next. Involved in petty crime and offences, his father would use his influence to bail him out and avoid scandal. Palpatine thinks that the Jedi have dedicated themselves to limiting change. They only do what they're told, and he'd have more respect for them if they used the Force to impose their will on the entire galaxy. Plagueis thinks to himself, "Before long I will own this human." Plagueis tried to look deeper into Palpatine, but without success. The psychic walls this youth had raised were impenetrable, which made him rare. Palpatine forms an attachment to Plagueis and was reaching out to him not just as an employer, but as a potential advisor. Palpatine's premonitions were almost always correct. Who better than a human to wear the mask of power while an immortal Sith Lord rules in secret? Palpatine and his father get into an argument and Palpatine attacks him using the Force. He tells Plagueis that he's killed his family and Plagueis offers to cover up the evidence. The dark side had brought them together and the dark side would decide whether Palpatine would be his apprentice. The Sith are the prodigal offspring destined to return and overthrow the Jedi. Palpatine pledges himself to the dark side and he's given the name Sidious. Plagueis tells him, "You must see every living thing as nothing more than a tool to elevate you. The actions of the Sith begin from the self and flow outward. We stalk the Force like hunters rather than surrender like prey to its enigmatic whims." He tells Sidious that they will have to sabotage the dynamic Darth Bane set in motion because they will need each other if they are to realize their ultimate goal. Plagueis tests Palpatine through torturous conditions and reveals it will take a decade to train him. In a sense married to his work, Plagueis' real bride was the dark side of the Force, what the ancients called Bogan, as separate from Ashla. The ancients were the Celestial, the Rakata. A Jedi sufficiently strong in the Force still cannot produce real Sith lightning. In order to summon and to use lightning properly, you will someday have to be in the receiving end of its power. Palpatine asks if he'll be physically transformed. Plagueis replies, "Surely you know the lore of Darth Sion and Nihilist, but whether it will happen to you, I cannot say. For 1,000 years the Sith have allowed themselves to be reduced to the stuff of folklore. A cunning politician is capable of wreaking more havoc than 2 Sith Lords armed with vibroblades, lightsabers, or force pikes." Palpatine becomes the ambassador of Naboo, and he says that if the opportunity should ever arise, he will accept the role of senator. Plagueis had collected more than a dozen beings of diverse species and had been subjecting them to a wide range of experiments involving violation, telepathy, healing, regeneration, and life extension, with some promising results. Plagueis hadn't lost interest in Venomous, but the Yanchori's immunity to force suggestion had provided him with a new line of investigation. If the Yanchori's midichlorians had evolved to protect the species naturally strong in the Force, then it was proof that the Sith of the Bane line had been on the right path. It had been theorized by Jedi and Sith that the balance between the light and dark sides was under the guidance of a group of entities called the Celestials. Only the Sith understood that sentient life was in the verge of a transformative leap through manipulation of midichlorians or the overthrow of the group that supervised them. The divide between organic life and the Force could be bridged, and death erased from the continuum. The ancient Sith had come halfway across the bridge, including Emperor Vitiate, who lived for 1,000 years. They were too focused on worldly power, they ended up trapped between realms. Would Plagueis one day manipulate midichlorians to produce forceful beings, even in the absence of fertilization? On Dathomir, Palpatine sensed and followed a pulse of Force energy. A woman, Night Sister, gave him a Zabrak child as a gift, not of the Eridonian sort, rather a Dathomirian. The child's name is Maul. Plagueis says, "Target midichlorians and we target life itself. The Jedi will have to be felled from within. We will have to exploit their vanity and blind obedience to the Republic. They must be made to appear the enemies of peace and justice rather than the guardians. Great care has to be taken not to turn them into martyrs." Plagueis stated that in this era, only a human can rise to the top of Coruscant's biased political heap. So Palpatine will be Chancellor, and appoint Plagueis as co-Chancellor to advise him in secret behind the throne. Palpatine flatters him, he says, "In all of Sith history, you will be known as Plagueis the Wise." Plagueis' parting words to Palpatine before sending him to assassinate Senator Vidar Kim: "Remember why the Sith are more powerful than the Jedi, Sidious. Because we are not afraid to feel. We embrace the spectrum of emotions, from the heights of transcendent joy to the depths of hatred and despair. Fearless, we welcome whatever path the dark side sets us on, and whatever destiny it lays out for us." At times it was really difficult for them to grasp that they would see in their lifetime the fall of the Republic and the annihilation of the Jedi Order. Tenebris introduced Plagueis to Kamino early on in his apprenticeship. The Kaminoans used to be land dwellers for millions of years preceding a great flood. They constructed massive stilt cities that were completed as their world was being submerged. They began cloning as a way to preserve their species. Plagueis regarded them as almost Sith-like in their moral aloofness and scientific objectivity. Plagueis believes that for all of Palpatine's growing strength from the dark side, he remained a prisoner to his emotions. Sidious wouldn't have his mistakes explained to him, but he needed to experience the consequences. In Palpatine's first apartment on Coruscant, he had a statue which contained his original hand-built lightsaber concealed in a cylindrical cavity undetected by security scans. Palpatine was to meet Jedi Ron Kim at his father's funeral to allow him to test his ability to conceal his true nature from another Force user. Plagueis says, "Be yourself, submerged in the unified pattern to which the Jedi are attuned, visible in the Force, but not as a Sith. Since you cannot allow yourself to be seen, you must make certain that you are taken for granted, disguised in the profane, camouflaged in the routine, in those same realms from which you can attack without warning when necessary." Palpatine befriends Ronar to gain more insight into the workings of the Jedi and their role as peacekeepers. On the few occasions Plagueis has encountered Dooku, he had sensed something in him that warranted further investigation. Are the Jedi not an army, or at least capable of becoming one should they need arise? Sifo-Dyas says, "We were an army at one time, but our enemies were vanquished. The Republic would only militarize in the instance of a perceived threat." Plagueis thought perhaps it would be better for the Kaminoans to create an army to fight alongside the Jedi, rather than against them. While he and Plagueis were more than equal to the most powerful of the Jedi, Palpatine understood that they were no match for the combined strength. The Jedi would fall only with the full collaboration of the dark side, only when the Force was willing to conspire in their downfall. Palpatine spent most of his days at the Rotunda and his nights exploring Coruscant. He continued his Sith training without guidance from Plagueis by reading ancient Sith texts that Plagueis dismissed as worthless. Palpatine is asked to a meeting with the STP in a lower tier district known as Potu, which stood for the periphery of the Ooskru, or better known as the Peril of the Ooskru, an area accessed by the Deep Court Maglev line, home to gangs, murderers and thieves. It wasn't uncommon to find senators there mingling with shady beings, flirting with danger. Palpatine's abducted and taken towards the works. Senator Pack's team suspects that Palpatine has known Plagueis more than 10 years and that Plagueis is responsible for the assassination of Vidar Kim. Palpatine relishes his secret identity, but he wanted it to be known that he was a being who should not be trifled with, that he wielded ultimate authority. Assassins infiltrate the initiation ceremony by beheading Lars Hill and launching decapitator discs at the remaining moons. I forgot to mention that Plagueis takes the droid 11-4D from the Wobegon. 11-4D is hit by the discs. Plagueis uses the Force to numb the pain after losing a chunk of his neck and jawbone. This was not the life Palpatine imagined for himself when he had sworn loyalty to the dark side. He wondered if there were powers Plagueis was keeping for himself. Palpatine realized that Plagueis had been too focused on his plan, that he had neglected to think he could be outmaneuvered. Palpatine rescues Plagueis and they destroy the rest of the assassins and Pack's team, then tamper with the scene to confuse investigators and the Jedi. Arriving on Abora, Palpatine sees Plagueis' library of texts, scrolls and holocrons, which was the data he'd been craving since his apprenticeship began. Addressing his wounds, Plagueis says to Palpatine, "Your thoughts betray you. Do you think that Malik's powers were weakened by Revan's lightsaber?" Plagueis will tutor Sandhill personally as chairman of the banking clan. They must arrange for worlds in the Outer Rim to suffer while the core prospers. The IBC will finance the war. The Jedi have long known that the dark side has been reawakened. Now they have felt it on their own Coruscant. Palpatine suggests training someone in the Sith arts to execute missions like a Darth Plagueis, but not an apprentice or someone who could ever aspire to become a true Sith Lord. Someone skilled in stealth and combat who could be eliminated when he was no longer needed. Palpatine had left Maul in the care of custodial droids on Mustafar. Mustafar served as a place to dispose of enemies and evidence. Palpatine is to train Maul, then relocate him to Orsis to be trained by a Feline named Trezza. Chancellor Finis Valorum was nearing the end of his 2-year term of office. Half the senators in the Rotunda were living double lives, accepting bribes from the Trade Federation, facilitating slavery, smuggling spice and death sticks. Palpatine had now moved to his exclusive address at 500 Republica. Plagueis had trained himself to go without sleep, devoting 2 decades to night and day experimentation with midichlorian manipulation so that he might live forever. When training, Palpatine allowed Maul to believe he was more powerful than he really was. On seeing his lightsaber produce 2 blades, Plagueis said, "A saber staff, the weapon of Exar Kun." Maul had been trained to be a fighting machine rather than a true apprentice. Yoda and the rest of the Council members will double their meditation sessions in an effort to peer into the future, only to discover it clouded and unknowable. That complacency has opened the door to catastrophe. They bask in self-assurance in their castle on Coruscant, ill-equipped for the world we have spent a millennium bringing into being. We get mention of Padme Nabiri, Captain Riccoli from Bravo Squadron. Sith in the past have claimed to have had the ability to fly, become invisible, or transport themselves through space and time. By manipulating the midichlorians, Plagueis again and again allowed Venomous to die, then resurrected him to life, until his organs had given out and was granted death. The power to keep another alive wasn't enough for him. Drunk on power, he attempted to bring into being a creation of his own, the birth of a forceful being. The abandoned Lamerge building at the Works had now become Maul's home and training ground. Palpatine had made him prideful. As Sidious, Palpatine now reveals himself as a Sith Lord to Viceroy Newt Gunray. Gunray says, "The Sith have been extinct for 1,000 years. Sidious says, "Through the centuries we have taken up just causes and revealed ourselves to select beings." Jabba meets with Plagueis. His full name is Jabba Desilajik Tyr. Jabba might not have been so sociable if he knew how many of his species Plagueis had experimented on for their immunity to force suggestion. We learn Bib Fortuna was a former spice smuggler, and Effluent Man who had supplied swoops to a gang of upstarts. Mention of Komari Vosa, who had been a former Jedi pupil of Dooku. Dooku tells Palpatine he is thinking of leaving the Order. He can no longer abide the decisions of the Council. We learn that there had been a conflict between the Jedi and Mandalorian mercenaries at Galidron. Dooku's former apprentice, Komari Vosa, had actually become infatuated with him. Dooku feels he's an ineffective teacher, as Qui-Gon has become a solitary and secretive rogue. Dooku tells Palpatine that 19 Jedi have left the Order before him. The Jedi are fixated on prophecy. They await the coming of a Redeemer who will bring balance to the Force and restore order. For the Jedi, mastery was conferred when one attained a true understanding of the ways of the Force. For the Sith, this was just the beginning. There's mention of Padme and her parents, and Palpatine suggests that Padme be elected as the next Queen of Naboo. Darth Maul can see the spire from the Jedi Temple from the Works and uses electro-binoculars to try and catch a glimpse of a Jedi. Maul has also named his speeder bike Bloodfin. We learn that Yoda had taken Dooku from Serenno, but he had failed to take Serenno from Dooku. Plagueis uses the Infiltrator to escape an attack on Sojourn. From the top of Plagueis' penthouse, you can see from the peaks of the Minari Mountains clear to the Western Sea, which was Coruscant's only instances of naked rock and surface water. Plagueis arranged for the Infiltrator to be presented as a gift to Maul. Maul names the ship Scimitar. Darth Maul will not be content until he has killed a Jedi Master, assuming pride didn't defeat him first. For 20 years now, Palpatine had enjoyed living a double life, but now he felt the urge to be known for who he was, and how powerful that he could be. There's a cool part where Plagueis uses the Force to remove a window pane so that he can climb through. He says, "In addition to being the basis for life, midichlorians are the elements that allow beings like him to use the Force." Imagine that, you need to have a sufficient midichlorian count to be able to use the Force. Darth Maul's been sent to take down the leaders of Black Sun. It's now in disorder and Prince Shizor will inherit the dregs. There's mention of Captain Panaka and Padme's handmaidens. A drawn-out war will ensure a galaxy pounded to a pulp and eager to embrace us. Plagueis has someone in mind he can persuade to place the initial order for clones from the Kaminoans. There's also mention of Jor Sabaoth, who's been enlisted to arbitrate a dispute among some of Alderaan's royal houses. There's mention of Yoda, Mace Windu and Adigalia, who will continue to support Chancellor Valorum for the remainder of his term of office. The new Vice-Chancellor was Mas Amedda. Padme, now as Queen Amidala, contacts Valorum and Palpatine stating that the Trade Federation has set up a blockade around Naboo. Palpatine receives word that Valorum has persuaded the Council to send 2 Jedi to Naboo. He calls Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan a pesky duo. It is the will of the dark side that we finally reveal ourselves. With his presence and the Force minimized, Plagueis observes Palpatine and Maul from afar as they walk along the balcony on Coruscant. Palpatine had formed an almost filial bond with Maul. Attached to the present, he failed to grasp that this was the last time he might see his apprentice in the flesh. After his duel with Qui-Gon on Tatooine, Maul's Crimson Blade identified him as a Sith. Palpatine tells Plagueis that he will fill Queen Amidala's head with doubts about Valorum for a vote of no confidence. Dooku tells Palpatine that Qui-Gon returned from Tatooine with a boy, believed to have been conceived by the Force. Qui-Gon believes Anakin stands at the centre of a vergence in the Force. Plagueis had to sense him for himself. He wondered if the Force had struck back 9 years earlier by conceiving a human being to restore balance to the galaxy. Plagueis just missed the chance to speak with Anakin as Qui-Gon had taken him to be tested at the Jedi Temple. He asked, "Are we undone?" While spying on Qui-Gon, Plagueis receives a vision of ferocious battles in space, the clashing of lightsabers, partitions of radiant light, and a black-helmeted cyborg rising from a table. The boy would change the course of history unless Maul killed Qui-Gon to stop Anakin from being trained. Qui-Gon was the key to everything. Plagueis learns that Anakin won first place at the Boonta Eve pod race. He says the boy's actions already echo across the stars. Plagueis becomes tired and intoxicated as Palpatine rehearses his speech. A look of sinister purpose contorts Palpatine's face. His election assured and Plagueis unsuspecting and asleep. Palpatine fires lightning at Plagueis while degrading him for everything he's done. Plagueis trusted that the rule of 2 had been superseded, but he failed to realise that he wouldn't be excused from it. Palpatine says, "The truth is I haven't changed. As we have clouded the minds of the Jedi, I clouded yours. Never once did I intend on sharing power with you. I needed to learn from you, no more, no less. Rest easy in your grave, Plagueis. In the end, I will be proclaimed Emperor. The Sith will have their revenge, and I will rule the galaxy." So after Plagueis' death, something was shading Palpatine's sense of triumph, a vague awareness of a power greater than himself. So it wasn't until he reached Theed that Palpatine realised that Darth Maul had been killed by the Jedi, and only then did he understand the reason of the sense of loss and profound solitude that he had experienced following the murder of Plagueis. He took great pleasure to stand among the Jedi and watch Qui-Gon's body reduced to ash. He was the first casualty in a war that had just been declared but not yet begun. Dooku actually wants to seek out the remaining Sith to ally with him, as he also wants to bring down the Republic. What separates the Sith from the Jedi is the way in which each approaches the Force. The Jedi Order has placed limits on itself, but the Sith have never shied away from incorporating the power of the dark side to accomplish their goals. Dooku had talent and would be a powerful placeholder, but Anakin is who Palpatine would take as his apprentice. Let Obi-Wan instruct him in the Force, let Skywalker grow embittered as his mother aged in slavery, the galaxy deteriorated around him, and his fellow Jedi fell in conflict. He was the perfect age to bond with a father figure and to be coaxed over to the dark side. The novel concludes, "We will continue to follow your career with great interest, and assure that it culminates in the ruination of the Jedi Order and the ascendancy of the Sith." So in conclusion, Darth Plagueis is an incredible novel. It felt like every sentence was packed full of Sith lore, which pulls from countless other works in the expanded universe, and makes so many connections to the movies, especially The Phantom Menace. It's a really good example of how these stories really enrich the Star Wars universe, and can enhance our experiences with the movies and the characters, which for me really emphasises the importance of continuity. One negative I'll admit is the references to Dave Filoni's Clone Wars, like Mother Talzin, and the change of Darth Maul's origins from Eridonian to a Dathomirian Zabrak hybrid. I really don't like those retcons that contradict the established canon. These felt really out of place and just inserted to legitimise the Clone Wars, and if you've seen my last video you'll kind of get an idea of how I feel about that show. Despite that, the novel is very dark, gritty and descriptive, It flows really well and it's really well thought out, and it'll have you turn the pages. It's a really good read. So as always, keep promoting the EU, keep reading, enjoy indulging and talking about real Star Wars. And lastly, please take a moment to subscribe to all the excellent channels listed in the acknowledgements, and also this channel if you feel inclined. Take care and lang may your Lumreek.
I've kind of lost control of Star Wars, so it's going off in a different path than what I intended. But the first 6 are very much mine and my philosophy. And I think that philosophy sort of goes beyond any particular time, because it's based on history, it's based on philosophy, it's based on a lot of things.